former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt.
The internet will disappear.
Eric Schmidt,
president of the company, stepping down from their roles.
The date is July of 2001. Out of the blue, Larry Page, co-founder and CEO of Google, sends a cryptic email summoning all Google engineers and project managers to meet outside his office to share some unexpected news. Within no time, all 130 of Google's engineers and project managers would form a huddle around Page's office, anxious what the news could be. Did Google get sued by Yahoo? Was AOL threatening a hostile takeover? Was the company about to run out of funding? As these thoughts raced through engineers' minds, Page candidly stepped out of his office. And with his usual hoarse voice, he would firmly announce that all project managers were fired, effective immediately. All engineers were to report to some newly hired engineer named Wayne Rosing. Everyone was stunned. This wasn't about the state of Google or the future of the company. This was about Page's personal hatred for managers. You see, Page strongly felt that Google had hired the best engineers in the world, and that these brilliant individuals didn't need untechnical morons telling them what to do. He felt that engineers should be able to choose what they work on and set their own paces, and he was hoping that Google's engineers would agree. But to his surprise, it was actually the engineers that would speak back. One engineer named Ron Dolan snapped back that what Page was doing was completely ridiculous and totally unprofessional. Page was gobsmacked. Surely, other engineers would understand the freedom of having no managers and support the purge. Maybe they just needed a bit of time to adjust, so Page would end the meeting and hoped that things would settle down. But they didn't. Within just a few weeks, projects would start lacking resources, redundancy would fall off a cliff, and engineers were craving one-on-one feedback from a direct superior. Unsurprisingly, VC funders were pissed, and it didn't take long for HR to step in. They would reinstate all of Google's fired project managers, and before you knew it, there was someone new on the chopping block, co-founder Larry Page. A man named Eric Schmidt was supposed to become the new CEO and the chairman of Google, and Larry Page would be relieved of all duties. Instead, he was to take on a more advisory role behind Eric. Page was devastated. He had just been Steve Jobs, kicked out of his own company, and basically given a pity role as an advisor. But looking back, this was for the best, as Eric Schmidt would take Google from being a brilliant startup to being a tech empire. He would lead the company for the next 10 years and make Google the leader in email, video sharing, search, maps, cloud, browsers, mobile, and more. He would grow a fortune of $25 billion for himself as he spearheaded Google into becoming a multi-hundred-billion-dollar company. But almost as magically as he appeared at Google, he would vanish, as this is the story of the forgotten CEO that saved Google from its own founders, Eric Schmidt. While Eric was an outsider, he was by no means unqualified. Eric was born in Falls Church, Virginia on April 27, 1955, to two academics. His mother, Eleanor, had a master's in psychology way back in the 1950s, and his father was an extremely well-respected economics professor. He not only taught at Virginia Tech and Johns Hopkins University, but he would go on to serve in the U.S. Treasury under President Richard Nixon. Little to say, Eric had a pretty strong background, which allowed him to excel at school and attend Princeton University. There, he would receive a bachelor's in electrical engineering in 1976, before moving on to UC Berkeley to get a master's. Eric went on to get a master's in electrical engineering and computer science in 1979, but it seems that one of his graduate school projects was even more valuable than the education itself. You see, Eric would design and implement a network called BerkNet that linked up the computer centers of two departments, the CS department and the EECS department. This project would actually evolve into becoming a PhD thesis about managing distributed software development, and Eric would cash in on this PhD in 1982, also from UC Berkeley. During his academic years, he would jump around a bunch of IT companies, from Bell Labs to Xerox's famous Palo Alto Research Center. But his real career in tech didn't start till 1983, when he joined Sun Microsystems as their first software manager. This is quite ironic, as this was the exact position that Larry Page was trying to eliminate at Google 20 years later. But let's just say that Eric would more than prove that this position was more than just a placeholder at Sun. Eric would rise up the ranks like a madman, first being promoted to Director of Software Engineering, before being promoted to Vice President of Software Products, and then Vice President of General Systems. During his 14 years at Sun, Eric oversaw the creation of one of the most respected tech empires of the 1990s. Now, of course, Sun would get crushed by the dot-com crash and be completely forgotten about, but that's a whole nother story. I guess you could say that it's a good thing that Eric left at the top in 1997 and took on a position as CEO and chairman of Novell. If you're not familiar with Novell, they were actually the second largest producer of software at one point, only beaten out by Microsoft. But by the late 1990s, they were a declining giant, and Eric was brought in to turn around the company. It seems that he was actually pretty successful at this, as the company was in a good enough position to acquire some beaten-down dot-com companies like Cambridge Technology Partners. But Eric wasn't able to get much further than that, as right after this acquisition, he would be called in to babysit Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Like Steve Jobs, Larry Page and Sergey Brin were actually able to choose who would take on the position of CEO, and it was them who chose Eric. Thankfully for Google, Eric wasn't another John Scully. While Google's board and investors did pressure Eric to rein in Larry and Sergey, Eric didn't really give in to this pressure. You see, though Eric was hired to be a babysitter, he felt that it was much more suitable for him to take on the role of personal assistant. While Eric was exceptionally qualified, maybe even more qualified than Larry and Sergey at the time, he recognized that it was not his place to inject his own vision for the company. At the end of the day, this was Larry and Sergey's company, and he was simply hired to help them execute their vision without pissing off the board or investors, and that's exactly what he did. After he took over, he would give Larry and Sergey full freedom to continue leading the company from a technical and visionary standpoint. Eric would simply take care of all of the daily nuances and obstacles that came along with running and scaling a startup. Things like addressing investors, addressing the board, handling public relations, dealing with HR, scaling the workforce, resolving conflicts, and launching products on time and on budget. Basically, all of the boring stuff that comes along with being CEO. But while boring, this is the lifeblood of any company, and especially an up-and-coming startup like Google. Also, if you have any doubts about just how much freedom Eric gave Larry and Sergey, here's how many acquisitions went down at Google. Larry and Sergey would find something that interested them. They would buy the company, and Eric would find out after everything was said and done. This is actually how Google ended up with Android and Google Maps. A regular CEO would probably be quite bothered by this, and rightfully so. But Eric figured that Larry and Sergey were the most incentivized to not ruin the company. Aside from giving Larry and Sergey space, Eric also formed key relationships with other tech companies. For example, in late 2006, he would join Apple's board of directors right before the launch of the iPhone. But despite all this freedom, for the first few years, Larry always had a level of distrust with Eric. I mean, after all, Eric was literally hired to replace Larry. But over time, Larry would grow comfortable with delegating basically everything to Eric other than the vision. Larry was never a fan of meetings, but he was intent on attending them in the early days, as he wanted to make sure that Eric didn't overrule his voice. But by 2007, he would stop attending meetings altogether, as he trusted that Eric would carry out what he wanted. And by 2008, Larry would also stop doing interviews altogether, stating that that was what Eric was for. Larry and Eric were getting along better than the board could have ever imagined, but this golden period didn't last forever. As Larry and Sergey got to know Eric better, they realized that while he was exceptional at execution, he wasn't a risk-taker. Sure, he was willing to let Larry and Sergey mess around with acquisitions and run crazy April Fool's Day pranks with the Gmail and YouTube. But when it came to something that could truly threaten the company, Eric would always choose the conservative way out, and one of the best examples of this was with Chrome. Chrome was pretty late to the browser scene, having not been released till late 2008. But this wasn't because Chrome was an afterthought, it was because Eric wouldn't allow for Chrome. Larry and Sergey had actually pitched Chrome to Eric for 6 full years, but he always rejected the idea. It wasn't until Larry and Sergey went behind Eric's back and secretly developed a Chrome prototype that Eric simply gave up on trying to stop them. Now, of course, Chrome would go on to be a roaring success, so this was definitely something that Eric got wrong, but it's not what pushed him out. What pushed him out was his stance on China. As you know, the CCP, and you either play by their rules or you get out. Throughout the early 2000s, Eric had worked painstakingly hard to play by the CCP's rules and to get Google launched in China in 2006. But by the late 2000s, China was changing up the rules and they wanted Google to censor certain topics. While not ideal, Eric was more than happy to do this. After all, he felt that it was more important for Google to stay relevant in what he describes as the world's largest consumer marketplace. Larry and Sergey, however, disagreed. They felt that it was more important for Google to stick by their motto of "don't be evil" and not allow for censorship. Larry and Sergey would end up getting their way, and Google would leave China in 2010. For the first time, Larry felt that Eric was pulling Google in a different direction, a direction that he didn't want to go down. It quickly became clear to Larry that it was time for Eric to go and for himself to take the reins once again. And given that Larry now had a relatively positive relationship with the board, thanks to Eric, he was able to lobby for himself to become CEO once again. Eric, who was quickly approaching 60, didn't really resist. He'd been there for nearly 10 years, and it felt like a natural time to move on. So he would leave with the remark, "I believe Larry is ready. I'm sure he'll do a fantastic job." And with that, Larry was CEO once again. But the truth was that he wasn't really ready. He felt that the biggest limiter for Google wasn't managers, but rather shareholders. He may have very well been right, but let's just say, it's not a great idea to make shareholders an enemy as a public CEO. Larry would learn this the hard way, and he would only last as CEO for a few years. Pretty soon, he would promote Sundar Pichai to CEO, leading us to the modern-day Google. In the end, Larry and Sergey truly are the visionaries behind Google, but their visions would have never materialized if it wasn't for Eric. The reality was that while Larry and Sergey were brilliant engineers and forward thinkers, they just weren't all that great businessmen. And if it wasn't clear the first time around, it was definitely clear the second time around. They needed someone to focus and execute on their ideas, and that's exactly what Eric did. To be honest, Eric still had a few good years in him at Google, but I suppose it all worked out fine anyway. All of the stock that Eric earned during his tenure made him the 72nd richest person in the world, with a net worth of $21 billion. But that's arguably the smallest part of his legacy. Did you know about Eric Schmidt? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you would like to see more videos about untold business legends. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest free video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.